Welcome to Uncloseted Conversations. Even if you stumbled upon this channel by accident, you are welcome here. The stories here are from my heart, from my soul, from my pen to your ears. I hope that you will stay a little longer and open yourself to the magic of storytelling. Here I write fiction, and though not always aligning with reality, it still tugs at heartstrings. Stories are escapes and sometimes a balm to the soul. So, enjoy your time here, and if reality presses down too loud and too hard, come knock at the door, come in, take a seat, grab a coffee, and just exhale. These are veil-bound stories, and the space is free and non-judgmental. Sit back, earphones or pods in, and let's listen to another exquisite romance. The surgeon against the unyielding authority of the Italian Iron CEO. In the theater of life, she performs the miracles. In the empire of power, she dictates the terms. But in the silence between them, they find the cure. Chapter 1. Coincident Meeting. Dr. Elena Montgomery, head of thoracic surgery at St. James Hospital, was a woman defined by precision. She had climbed the grueling ladder from medical school to residency, then fellowship, and finally to the peak of the largest hospital in the district. After 10 years of life-saving incisions and heavy consultations, she was ready for something more permanent than a surgical result. She was ready to settle. But finding a partner proved more complex than a craniotomy. Her friends, bless their persistent souls, had tried the blind dating circuit, setting her up with women they swore were the one. But by the second date, the same ghost always haunted the table: Elena's schedule. Between the emergency calls and the grueling hours, she'd received enough "sorry, this isn't going to work" messages to fill a textbook. She had almost resigned herself to the idea that she wasn't built for a family. Yet, the yearning in her soul for a real connection kept her awake more often than her on-call beeper ever could. Exhausted, Elena sank into the worn couch of the on-call room. She leaned her head back, the strain behind her eyes thrumming like a dull engine. She let her eyelids flutter shut. "Just 5 minutes," she whispered to the shadows of the empty room. She was pulled from a heavy, dreamless sleep by the sensation of a small hand on her face. A weight settled onto her lap, and her eyes shot open. She found herself staring into the purest blue eyes she had ever seen. A little boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, was perched on her knees. "Say, Sveglia? Are you awake?" his little voice queried, his tone light and curious as a finger poked her nose. Elena's heart did a slow roll in her chest. She reached out, steadying him by his shoulders, and blinked away the fog of sleep. She looked around the room, but they were alone. "Ciao, Piccolino," she murmured. The boy's subsequent smile made her breath hitch. "Ciao, Dottoressa." He reached out to touch her cheek, his palm warm as a ray of sunshine against her skin. Elena stood up, tucking him securely into her arms. "Dove sono I tuoi?" "Where are your parents?" she asked. He simply pointed toward the hallway. The quiet of the unit was shattered by a commotion near the nurse's station. As Elena stepped into the corridor, a tall, dark-haired woman came rushing toward them. Elena froze. For a moment, she completely forgot the child in her arms. The woman reached them, her face a mask of frantic relief, and took the boy. "Grazie a Dio," she exhaled, crushing him to her chest. The boy let out a delighted squeal. "Mi hai trovato, zia." "You found me, auntie," he laughed, winding his arms around her neck. Elena remained stationary, her professional mask slipping. The woman was a vision. She had long, wavy black hair and deep gray eyes that felt like a storm front moving in. Her nose was sharp, her jawline chiseled from marble, and she stood just a fraction taller than Elena. Elena's eyes raked over her with a surgeon's focus, a black silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to stir the imagination, cream slacks that sat dangerously low on her hips, and high heels that looked like they could draw blood. "Thank you for finding him, doctor." The woman's voice was a low vibrato, a cello string vibrating against Elena's ribs. "He found me, actually," Elena managed, her voice softer than intended. She reached out to ruffle the boy's hair, and to her surprise, he lunged back toward her, reaching out his arms. Elena saw the flicker of shock on the gorgeous woman's face. Elena took him back for a brief, tight hug, then handed him back to his aunt, her skin tingling where their hands brushed. "Ci vediamo in giro, piccolo. See you around, little one," Elena said, turning to make a quick escape. "Doctor, thank you again," the woman called out, stopping Elena in her tracks. "I would like to thank you properly, if you'll let me." She shifted the boy to her hip and fished a card from her bag. Elena took the card. It was minimalist, just a name and a number, Giulietta Carducci. "No need to thank me," Elena said, her pulse drumming in her ears. "He woke me in time for my next consultation, so I should be the one thanking him." Giulietta's gaze intensified. "This is Piero," she said, introducing the boy. Then her eyes locked onto Elena's. "And you are?" "Elena. Elena Montgomery." Giulietta smiled, and for a heartbeat, the hospital sounds faded to a hum. Elena swallowed hard, shifting her weight. "Get a grip, Elena," she scolded herself. Holding up the card, she managed a quick nod. "I'll call." Then, the head of thoracic surgery practically ran down the corridor. Giulietta watched her go, a slow, knowing smirk spreading across her lips. She lifted Piero into the air. "Mi hai portato bellezza, Piero. You brought me beauty, Piero," she whispered as they turned to find Liliana. Chapter 2: Consultation with Destiny. Elena made it to her office and clicked the door shut, leaning her back against the heavy wood. She stayed there for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of Giulietta's perfume, something like sandalwood and rain, seemed to have followed her down the hall, clinging to her white coat. She walked to her desk with unsteady legs and sat down, staring at the business card. Giulietta Carducci. The name sounded like a song, or perhaps a warning. Elena tucked the card into her desk drawer, sliding it out of sight, and pressed her cold palms to her flushed cheeks. "Professionalism, Elena," she whispered to the empty room. "She's the aunt of a patient. A 6-year-old with a glioma. Focus." She pulled Piero's file toward her, forcing her brain to switch from attraction to anatomy. She traced the lines of the MRI scans, the cold, clinical reality of the tumor grounding her. She was the best in her field for a reason. She could do this. A sharp knock at the door shattered her concentration. Elena sat up straight, adjusted her stethoscope, and cleared her throat. "Come in." The door swung open, and the air in the room changed instantly. It wasn't just the medical gravity of the situation, it was the sheer presence of the woman leading the way. Piero lunged forward immediately, his little sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. "Dottoressa," he chirped, scrambling toward her chair. Elena caught him, a genuine smile breaking through her nerves. "Hey, Tiger. Back for more?" She looked up, and her breath hitched. Giulietta was standing by the door, her gray eyes roaming over Elena's office, the degrees on the wall, the organized chaos of the desk, before finally settling on Elena herself. Beside her stood another woman, younger and softer-featured, her eyes red-rimmed and anxious. "Dr. Montgomery," Giulietta said, her voice that same low, delicious vibrato. She didn't sit immediately. She stood behind the chair, her hands resting on the backrest. "This is my sister, Liliana Santavica, Piero's mother." Elena stood to shake Liliana's hand, offering a warm, practiced look of empathy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Liliana. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." Liliana's Italian accent was thick and strained with worry. "So, this is the doctor that Piero found in the dark? He has talked of nothing else for the last 10 minutes. She looked at her son, then back at Elena. "They say you're the best. That you can fix him." "I am going to do everything in my power," Elena promised, her voice steadying as she entered surgeon mode. She gestured to the chairs. "Please sit." As they settled in, Giulietta didn't take the seat further away. She chose the one directly across from Elena, crossing her long legs with a fluid grace that made the cream fabric of her slacks pull tight. "We have seen the local scans," Jolita said, her gaze intense, "but we wanted a specialist in the district. We want to know exactly what the head of thoracic sees when she looks at my nephew's brain." Elena opened the digital file, turning the monitor so they could see the gray and white images. The tumor is located near the base of the cerebellum. It's localized, which is good, but it's pressing on the areas that control motor function and balance. That's why he's been having those dizzy spells. As Elena pointed to the screen, she felt a presence beside her. Jolita had leaned in closer to see the monitor. She was so close that Elena could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder. "And the risk?" Jolita's voice dropped an octave, private and sharp. "Speak plainly, Dr. Montgomery. My sister needs the truth, but I need the details." Elena met those storm-gray eyes. The flirtatious energy from the hallway hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed into something more focused and fierce. "The risk is high," Elena said honestly. "But his age is an advantage. He's resilient." Jolita's gaze dropped to Elena's lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "Resilience is a family trait," she murmured. "I hope you are as steady with a scalpel as you are with your words." "I haven't dropped one yet," Elena countered, her wit finally returning. Jolita's lips quirked into a devastating smirk. "Good. Because I have very high expectations for the people I let into my life." Chapter 3. Thunderstorms are effective. Elena tapped the screen, closing the MRI files. "I'll have my patient coordinator reach out this afternoon to finalize the pre-op schedule. We need to move quickly, but we'll be thorough." Liliana nodded, her hands trembling as she pulled Piero into her lap. "Thank you, doctor. We put our hearts in your hands." "I take that very seriously," Elena said softly. As Liliana began to gather Piero's small backpack, Jolita didn't move. She remained leaned against the edge of the desk, her presence occupying Elena's personal space like an invading army. "Now that the business is settled," Jolita began, her voice dropping into that low, silk-wrapped register, "about that proper thank you. I know a place in the city, quiet, private. The kind of place where a busy surgeon can actually hear herself think." "Dinner? Tomorrow night?" Elena felt the heat climb her neck. "Miss Carducci, I have a policy. I don't usually socialize with the families of my patients. It's a matter of professionalism." Jolita interrupted, her smirk widening. She reached out, her fingers just barely grazing the edge of Elena's stethoscope. "I'm not the patient, Dr. Montgomery. And I promise not to talk about medicine over the osso buco." "Jolita, basta," Liliana sighed, standing up and casting a sharp, knowing look at her sister. She turned to Elena with an apologetic wince. "Doctor, please ignore her. When my sister sees something she likes, she forgets that the rest of the world is busy. She has the patience of a thunderstorm." Jolita didn't look away from Elena. "Thunderstorms are very effective, Sorelina." Liliana stepped forward, placing a hand on Jolita's arm and pulling her toward the door. "Do not distract the woman who is going to be inside our Piero's head," Liliana warned in a low, fierce Italian. "Wait until the boy is healed before you start your games." Jolita finally stood straight, smoothing the front of her cream slacks. She looked at Elena one last time, her gray eyes dancing with a challenge. "It isn't a game, Liliana," Jolita said simply. She looked back at Elena. "I'll leave the ball in your court, Dr. Montgomery. But I should warn you, I'm very good at the long game." With a wink at Piero and a nod to Elena, Jolita led her sister out of the office. Elena sat back in her chair, the silence of the room suddenly feeling deafening. She looked at the closed door, then slowly opened her desk drawer to stare at the business card. Her pulse was still racing. "A thunderstorm," Elena whispered to herself, rubbing her temples. She isn't kidding. Chapter 4. The Fine Line. Elena's apartment was a reflection of her professional life, minimalist, impeccably clean, and quiet. Usually, the silence was her sanctuary, a place to decompress from the sensory overload of the hospital. But tonight, the quiet felt heavy. She sat at her kitchen island, a glass of red wine untouched beside her. Spread out before her weren't menus or magazines, but high-resolution printouts of Piero's MRI. She traced the edge of the mass with a highlighter. The margins were tight. 1 millimeter too far to the left, and she risked his speech. A fraction too deep, and his motor skills could be compromised. This was the language of silence she knew best, the silent communication between a surgeon's hands and the anatomy of a patient. I hope you are as steady with a scalpel as you are with your words. Jalida's voice drifted through her mind, unbidden and vibrating with that low, honeyed Italian lilt. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, but that only made the image clearer. The way those gray eyes had dropped to her lips, the sharp, marble-carved line of her jaw, and the lingering scent of sandalwood. "Focus, Montgomery," she muttered, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She tried to visualize the surgery, step by step. The craniotomy, the retraction, the delicate teasing of the tumor away from healthy tissue. But every time she pictured the operating theater, she saw Jalida standing behind the observation glass, her storm-gray eyes watching every move, holding Elena accountable for the life of the boy she loved. Elena realized with a start that she was holding her breath. This was dangerous. In her line of work, emotional entanglement was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she went into that theater thinking about the aunt's smirk instead of the nephew's neural pathways, she was a liability. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. She had to compartmentalize. She needed to take Jalida Carducci and lock her in a very small, very secure box in the back of her mind, at least until Piero was in recovery. She reached for her phone, intending to set it to Do Not Disturb, but her thumb hovered over the screen. She hadn't called. She shouldn't call. Liliana's warning echoed in her head. Wait until the boy is healed. Elena took a slow, grounding breath, her surgical discipline fighting against a sudden, reckless spark of desire. She wouldn't call. Not tonight. She would be the doctor Piero needed. But as she looked back at the MRI, she knew the long game Jalida mentioned had already begun, and Elena was already losing her composure. Chapter 5: Summoning the Magic. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of St. James, but Elena barely noticed the light. She had been in the hospital since 5 a.m., re-reviewing the surgical plan. She was a fortress of logic today. The business card was tucked away in her desk drawer, and she had told herself it would stay there until Piero was breathing on his own in post-op. But then came the final pre-op check-in. Elena walked into the pediatric prep room, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Piero was sitting on the edge of the bed in a gown that was slightly too large, looking small but brave. Standing beside him, looking like she hadn't slept a wink but still managed to look like a runway model, was Jalida. This morning, the playfulness was gone, replaced by a raw, vibrating intensity. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer over a silk camisole, her hair pulled back into a sleek, severe ponytail that emphasized that lethal jawline. "Dottoressa," Piero whispered, reaching out. Elena took his hand, her thumb tracing small circles over his knuckles. "Ready for your big nap, Piero? When you wake up, that headache is going to be gone." "Will you be there?" he asked. "Every second," Elena promised. She looked up and caught Jalida's gaze. There was no witty banter this time. Jalida stepped closer, her scent, that sandalwood and rain, cutting through the sterile hospital's smell. She leaned in, her voice a low, urgent hum intended only for Elena's ears. "I know I have been persistent," Jalida murmured, her gray eyes searching Elena's. "But today, I don't care about the dinner or the long game. Just bring him back to us. Per favor." She reached out, her hand hovering as if she wanted to touch Elena's arm, but she pulled back at the last moment, respecting the boundary. The vulnerability in her eyes was more distracting than any flirtation could ever be. It made Elena want to protect not just the boy, but the woman standing in front of her. Elena nodded, her voice thick but certain. I will. 2 p.m. Operating Theater 4. The atmosphere in the OR was electric. The nurses and surgical techs moved with practiced efficiency, the clinking of metal instruments providing a rhythmic backdrop. Music, Sarah, Elena said, her voice muffled by her mask. The sharp, spirited violins of Vivaldi's Four Seasons began to fill the room. Elena stood at the head of the table, her hands scrubbed and gloved, held up in front of her chest. She closed her eyes. The room went silent, the team holding their breath. This was the moment. Elena tilted her head sharply to the left, a soft click sounding in her neck. She stayed like that for 5 seconds, visualizing the path through Piero's brain, summoning the magic as the staff whispered. She was no longer a woman distracted by a beautiful Italian. She was a master of her craft. She snapped her head back to center, her eyes opening with a cold, blue fire. Scalpel, she commanded. The surgery began. For 4 hours, the only sounds were the soaring crescendos of Vivaldi and Elena's calm, steady instructions. She moved with a grace that matched the music, her hands never wavering. She carved through the danger, millimeter by millimeter, reclaiming the boy's future from the mass that tried to steal it. The overhead surgical lights were a harsh, unforgiving white, turning the sterile field into the only world that mattered. Outside those doors, there was a woman with storm-gray eyes and a business card tucked in a desk. Inside, there was only the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator and the high-pitched ping of the heart monitor. Lower the microscope, Elena commanded, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of beeping electronics. The Vivaldi shifted into the winter movement, aggressive, fast, and demanding. It matched the pulse in Elena's fingertips. She was deep now, navigating the narrow corridors of the posterior fossa. The tumor was a pale, invading ghost, woven dangerously close to the brainstem. Bipolar cautery, she said, her hand out. The room held its breath. This was the crossroads. The tumor was tethered to a major vein. One slip, one tremor, and the magic would vanish, replaced by a tragedy Elena wouldn't be able to live with. She felt a drop of sweat roll down her temple, beneath her cap. She didn't blink. She visualized Giulitta's face, not as a distraction, but as a promise. Just bring him back to us. With the precision of a master jeweler, Elena teased the last fragment of the mass away from the delicate neural tissue. It came free. Suction, she whispered. It's out. All of it. Music off, she said. She looked at the monitor. Piero's vitals were perfect. A collective exhale rippled through the surgical team. The tension didn't disappear, it transformed into a quiet, vibrating awe. Elena stayed for the closure, her hands moving with the same lyrical grace as the violins, until the final knot was tied. Chapter 6. The Walk of Truth. Elena stepped out of the scrub room, her hands still damp from the wash, her skin smelling of antiseptic. She didn't stop at the locker, she walked straight toward the private waiting lounge. Every step felt like she was shedding her armor, leaving the head of thoracic behind and becoming just Elena again. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The room was dim, save for the glow of the city lights beginning to wake up outside. Liliana was slumped in a chair, her head in her hands, while Giulitta stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass. The moment the door clicked, Giulitta spun around. She looked haunted. The dangerous elegance was frayed at the edges, her hair was slightly messy, and her blazer had been discarded on a chair. When her eyes met Elena's, the fear in them was so naked it made Elena's chest ache. Elena didn't say a word at first. She simply nodded, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Liliana let out a sob of pure relief, collapsing back into her seat, but Giulitta didn't move. She stayed rooted to the spot, her chest heaving as she processed the silent news. She looked at Elena as if she were seeing a miracle. Elena walked over to them, her voice low and raspy from hours of silence. He's perfect. The margins were clean, and he's already beginning to wake up. He's a fighter, just like you said. Liliana rushed forward to hug Elena, weeping her thanks into the doctor's white coat. Elena held her, but her gaze was locked on Gelida, who remained a few feet away. Slowly, Gelida stepped forward. She didn't hug Elena. Instead, she reached out and took Elena's hand. Her palm was hot, her grip firm. She leaned in, her forehead almost touching Elena's, the scent of sandalwood and exhaustion wrapping around them. You summoned the magic, Gelida whispered, her voice a jagged, beautiful wreck. She looked down at Elena's hand, then back up into her eyes. I saw you through the glass. The way you tilted your head. I knew then. I knew you wouldn't let him go. The air between them sizzled, the professional boundary finally dissolving into the shared gravity of what had just happened. Go see him, Gelida, Elena said softly, using Gelida's first name reverently, though she didn't pull her hand away. I will, Gelida murmured. She leaned even closer, her breath a warm caress against Elena's ear. Now that he is safe, the long game has officially begun. Chapter 7. The Unstoppable Force. 3 days post-op, the atmosphere in Piero's recovery suite was a far cry from the sterile tension of the OR. The room was flooded with sunlight and the scent of expensive lilies, courtesy of the Carducci family. Elena stood by the bed, checking Piero's reflexes. He was laughing, trying to grab her stethoscope with a coordination that brought a surge of professional pride to her chest. You're doing amazing, Piero, Elena smiled, clicking her pen light shut. A few more days and you'll be running laps around the nurse's station. Then we go for gelato? Piero asked, his blue eyes bright. The biggest one they have, a voice vibrated from the doorway. Elena didn't have to look up to know who it was. The air in the room simply shifted, growing warmer and more charged. Gelida leaned against the doorframe, looking devastating in a tailored charcoal suit and a silk blouse the color of a bruised plum. She wasn't just flirting anymore, she was hunting. Dr. Montgomery, Gelida purred, walking into the room with a predatory grace. She stopped far closer than necessary, her presence making the hospital room feel small and intimate. You look tired. Heroism clearly takes its toll. It was just my job, Miss Carducci, Elena replied, though she felt the familiar flush creeping up her neck. A job you do with such exquisite focus, Gelida murmured. She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of Elena's white coat, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight to Elena's core. I believe we have a standing appointment. One that involves a very specific bottle of Amarone and a table where no one wears a mask. Gelida, Piantella, stop it. Liliana appeared from the ensuite bathroom, carrying a fresh vase of water. She marched over and physically stepped between her sister and Elena, using the vase as a literal shield. She is checking his vitals, not your dating profile, Liliana scolded, though there was a weary fondness in her voice. She turned to Elena with a sigh. I am so sorry, doctor. My sister has no off switch. She thinks because the surgery is over, you are now fair game. I am not a game, Liliana, Gelida said, her eyes never leaving Elena's. She stepped around her sister, leaning over the guardrail of Piero's bed to get back into Elena's line of sight. I am a destination. And I think Dr. Montgomery knows the way. Elena felt her pulse drumming. The professional distance she had fought so hard to maintain was crumbling under the sheer weight of Gelida's gaze. I should check on my other patients, Elena stammered, tucking her tablet under her arm. The card is still in your desk, isn't it? Gelida called out as Elena headed for the door. Elena paused at the threshold, her hand on the handle. She looked back and saw Gelida's devastating smirk and Liliana's exasperated eye roll. It's in the top drawer, Elena admitted, her voice a low confession. Gelida's smile widened, triumphant and warm. Then stop keeping me waiting, Elena. The boy is healed. Now it's our turn. Chapter 8. The Siege of St. James. Elena had thought that once the surgery was over, her life would return to its predictable, clinical rhythm. She was wrong. Giulietta Carducci didn't do predictable. It started on Tuesday morning. Elena walked into her office to find a small, minimalist box sitting on her desk, right on top of the stack of charts. There was no wrapping paper, just heavy, cream-colored cardstock with her name written in a sharp, elegant hand. Inside was a single, vintage fountain pen made of dark Italian resin. The note read, "For the woman who writes her own magic. I noticed your plastic one was leaking." Gee. Elena felt a heat crawl up her spine. She had been using a cheap hospital pen during the consultation, and Giulietta had noticed. She tucked the pen into her pocket, her heart doing a nervous flutter she hadn't felt since med school. On Wednesday, it was the coffee. Instead of the acidic sludge from the hospital cafeteria, a courier arrived at the nurse's station during the height of the morning rush. He handed Elena a thermal carafe of authentic Italian espresso, still steaming, accompanied by a small plate of cannoli that smelled of orange zest and ricotta. "She says you look like you haven't slept," the courier said with a shrug before disappearing. The nurses were already whispering. "Who is the secret admirer, Dr. Montgomery?" "Sarah," the head nurse teased, eyeing the pastry. "And can they send enough for the whole unit next time?" Elena didn't answer. She took the espresso back to her office, the rich, dark aroma filling the room. She reached into her top drawer and pulled out Giulietta's business card. She turned it over in her fingers. The long game was becoming a full-scale invasion. By Thursday, the gifts took a turn for the personal. A large, heavy bag was waiting for her after a grueling 12-hour shift. Inside was a luxurious, deep blue cashmere throw, the exact color of Elena's eyes. The note this time was shorter. "The on-call couch looks uncomfortable. This is softer. Sleep well, Elena. I'll see you in your dreams." Elena sank into her office chair, clutching the cashmere to her chest. It was impossibly soft, smelling faintly of that sandalwood and rain perfume. She was a scientist, a woman of logic and steel, but she was being hunted by a master of the heart. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. She could feel the Italian charm wrapping around her like the cashmere, warm, expensive, and utterly inescapable. Just then, her office door swung open. It was Liliana, coming to pick up Piero's final discharge papers. She saw the cashmere, then saw the look on Elena's face. "Oh, madre mia," Liliana sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "She has started with the gifts, hasn't she? The Carducci scorched earth policy of romance." Elena flushed crimson. It's just a thank you, Liliana." "No," Liliana said, walking over and gently touching the blue fabric. "When Giulietta sends cashmere, it's a promise. She is trying to buy your focus, doctor. She wants you thinking of her every time you close your eyes." Liliana looked Elena in the eye, her expression serious. "Be careful. My sister doesn't just want a dinner. She wants the whole person. Are you ready for that?" Elena looked down at the soft blue wool in her lap. "I don't know if I have a choice," she whispered. Chapter 9. The Carducci Iron. While Elena was navigating the quiet halls of St. James, Giulietta was stepping into a different kind of theater, one where the scalpels were made of corporate law and hostile takeovers. The boardroom of Carducci Technologies was a cathedral of glass and steel, overlooking the Milan skyline. The air was frigid, the silence broken only by the rhythmic tapping of a pen against a mahogany table. The headline on the digital screens was glaring: "Carducci Air in Surgery. IS the Empire at Stake." A grainy paparazzi photo of Giulietta looking haunted in the hospital waiting room accompanied the text. "The market is reacting to the perception of instability," Giulietta, Alberto, the oldest member of the board, said with a thin, oily smile. "There are rumors you've been distracted, spending more time in a pediatric ward than in the lab. The investors are asking if the CEO has lost her edge." Giulietta sat at the head of the table, her blazer buttoned tight, her expression as unreadable as a slab of obsidian. She didn't look like the woman who sent cashmere blankets and espresso. She looked like a predator. "My nephew had a successful surgery," Giulietta said, her voice a cold, terrifyingly calm vibrato. "If you consider ensuring the future of the Carducci bloodline a distraction, Alberto, perhaps you've forgotten the meaning of the word legacy." "We're just concerned about focus," another board member chimed in. "The merger with Sterling is in a delicate phase. We need the Iron Woman, not a doting aunt." Giulietta stood up slowly. The movement was so predatory that the man visibly recoiled. She leaned over the table, her knuckles white as she pressed them into the wood. "I built this company from a garage in Florence while most of you were still arguing over your inheritances," she said, her Italian accent sharpening like a blade. "I do not lose my edge. I sharpen it. If any of you think for a single second that my family's health makes me a target, I suggest you look at the Q3 projections." She snapped her fingers, and a new set of data filled the screens. The numbers were aggressive, dominating. "While you were reading gossip columns, I closed the deal with the Ministry of Defense," she revealed, a lethal smirk playing on her lips. "I don't go soft, Alberto. I go for the throat. And if I see another leak regarding my family, I won't be looking for a surgeon. I'll be looking for an undertaker for your careers." The room went deathly silent. Giulietta grabbed her leather briefcase, her movement fluid and commanding. "Meeting adjourned. I have a proper thank you to attend to. The aftermath." As she stepped into the elevator, the iron mask didn't slip, but her hand reached into her blazer pocket. She pulled out her phone and looked at a photo she had taken of Elena in the hospital, not as a doctor, but as the woman who had held Giulietta's world together. She felt the sharp contrast of her life, the cold brutality of the boardroom and the terrifying, sultry heat Elena stirred in her. She typed a quick message to her assistant, "Cancel my 6 p.m. Send a car to St. James. I'm tired of playing the long game from a distance." Chapter 10. The Unstoppable Intent. The hospital parking garage was a cavern of concrete and fluorescent hums, usually the place where Elena finally let her shoulders drop. But tonight, the air felt different. Parked directly across from her modest sedan was a matte black Ferrari, its engine cooling with a rhythmic, metallic ticking that sounded like a countdown. Giulietta was leaning against the driver's side door. Gone was the boardroom blazer. She wore a silk black jumpsuit that draped over her frame like liquid, cinched at the waist with a gold belt that looked like a trophy. She was holding a single, deep red rose not in a bouquet, but stripped of its thorns. Elena stopped 10 feet away, her gym bag heavy on her shoulder, her mind still reeling from a day of back-to-back consultations. "The Ferrari is a bit much, don't you think?" Elena asked, her voice breathy despite her attempt at professional coolness. "I find that subtlety is often wasted on people who spend their lives looking through microscopes," Giulietta countered. She straightened up and walked toward Elena. Every step was a deliberate, synchronized movement of grace and pheromones. "You're late, Elena. I've been calculating the cost of your time per minute. I had a patient." "I know." Giulietta stopped just inches away. She didn't touch Elena, but the heat radiating from her was a physical force. She held out the rose, the petals brushing against the lapel of Elena's coat. "I'm not here as the aunt of a patient tonight. I'm not even here as the CEO of Carducci Tech." She leaned in, her voice dropping into that dangerous, velvety register that bypassed Elena's brain and went straight to her pulse. "I am here as a woman who hasn't been able to taste her wine or sleep through the night because she is haunted by the way a certain surgeon tilts her head before she performs miracles." Elena felt her resolve liquefying. "Giulietta, I told you. The boundaries." "The boundaries were for Piero," Giulietta interrupted softly. She reached up, her thumb finally grazing Elena's jawline. Her touch was featherlight but possessive. "Piero is home eating pasta and arguing with his mother. The boundaries have served their purpose. Now, there is only you, me, and a reservation that I will personally burn to the ground if you don't get in that car. Jalida didn't use force. She didn't pull. She simply looked into Elena's eyes with an intensity that promised a world far more exciting than a sterile ore. She tilted her head to the left, a playful, devastating mimicry of Elena's magic move. "Summon the magic, Elena," Jalida whispered. "But do it for us this time." Elena looked at the car, then back at the woman who was currently dismantling 10 years of emotional discipline with a single look. She took a breath, the scent of Jalida's sandalwood perfume finally winning the war. "I need to change," Elena managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. Jalida's smirk was slow and triumphant. She reached past Elena to open the passenger door of the Ferrari. "I have a dress in the back that will make you forget you ever owned a white coat. Shall we?" Chapter 11. The Metamorphosis. Elena didn't go to a hotel. She didn't even leave the building. She retreated to the private executive bathroom on the surgical floor, the heavy bag Jalida had provided clutched in her hand. When she pulled the dress out, the silk felt like water against her skin. It wasn't just a black dress, it was an architectural masterpiece. It featured a high, modest neckline that spoke of her professional restraint, but the back was a different story, a deep, plunging V that dropped to the small of her back, held together by delicate, gold chain straps that mimicked a surgical suture, but far more provocative. She stepped out of her scrubs, the fabric falling to the floor like a discarded skin. She pulled the silk over her head, zipped the side, and stepped into the black stilettos Jalida had somehow known were her exact size. She let her hair down, the auburn waves cascading over her bare shoulders, and applied a slash of deep red lipstick, the color of a heartbeat. Elena took a breath, looked at her reflection, and, for the first time in a decade, didn't see a surgeon. She saw a woman who was ready to be found. The Walk of Fire. The heavy double doors of the surgical wing swung open, and the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of high heels on the linoleum cut through the evening hum of the hospital. The transformation was so total that a group of residents stopped mid-sentence, their clipboards hanging limp in their hands. As Elena passed the nurse's station, a low, appreciative wolf whistle echoed from the break room. "Dr. Montgomery?" Sarah, the head nurse, gasped, her eyes wide. "Is there a gala we weren't invited to, or did you just decide to break the hospital's heart tonight?" Elena didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She felt a surge of adrenaline that rivaled a successful bypass. She walked toward the elevators, where the doors were just sliding open. Jalida was standing there, leaning against the interior wall of the elevator, her thumb held on the open button. She had been waiting. As Elena approached, Jalida's practiced, predatory smirk didn't just fade, it vanished. Her breath caught audibly in the quiet corridor. She stood up straight, her gray eyes raking over Elena from the sharp red of her lips to the lethal line of the black silk. For the first time, the Iron CEO looked completely unarmed. She stared at Elena as if she had personally hung the moon in the sterile hospital sky. "You took your time," Jalida whispered, her voice rough, lacking its usual polished edge. She stepped out of the elevator to meet Elena halfway, her gaze lingering on the bare skin of Elena's shoulders. "I had to make sure the magic was ready," Elena countered, her voice steady and low. Jalida reached out, her fingers trembling just a fraction as she traced the gold chain on Elena's shoulder. "Elena, I have closed billion-euro deals that felt less significant than this moment. You look, Divina." She leaned in, the scent of sandalwood now mixing with the faint, sweet smell of Elena's perfume. She didn't kiss her, not yet, but she let her lips hover just an inch from Elena's ear. "The car is waiting. And tonight, I think I'll be the one who needs a surgeon, because my heart is doing things it hasn't done in years." She held out her arm, and Elena took it. As they walked toward the elevator, every eye in the lobby was on them, the surgeon and the CEO, a power dynamic that was about to shift into something much more private. The matte black Ferrari didn't head for the suburbs. Instead, It tore through the neon-lit arteries of the city, the engine's growl echoing off the glass skyscrapers. Jalita drove like she lived, fast, precise, and with a total disregard for anyone else's lane. They pulled up to a nondescript steel door in a cobblestone alley. No sign, just a small brass plate that read L'Eclisse. "It's private," Jalita murmured, handing the keys to a valet who approached the car with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "Because I don't feel like sharing you with the crowd tonight." Chapter 12. Destination reached. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted from the cold city air to a den of dark velvet, amber lighting, and the low, heavy thrum of jazz. It was the kind of place where secrets were traded over 100-year-old scotch. The maitre d' bowed low, but as they walked toward a secluded booth in the back, Elena noticed the eyes. Men in tailored suits and women draped in silk paused their conversations. The sight of the Iron Woman of Carducci Tech was enough to draw stares, but the woman on her arm, Elena, glowing in the black silk dress, was the real showstopper. Elena felt a flutter of self-consciousness, her hand tightening on Jalita's arm. She felt like a queen, yes, but a queen in a foreign court. Jalita noticed immediately. She stopped mid-stride, her gaze sweeping the room. It wasn't a warm look. It was a cold, territorial claim. She locked eyes with a businessman at a nearby table who was lingering a second too long on the plunging back of Elena's dress. Jalita didn't say a word. She simply tilted her chin, her gray eyes flashing with a silent, sharp warning. "She is mine. Look elsewhere." The man quickly found his drink very interesting. "Don't mind them," Jalita whispered, leading Elena into a booth shielded by a heavy silk curtain. "They are just realizing that the most beautiful thing in Milan isn't a building or a car, it's the woman currently sitting across from me." The table was already set. A bottle of Amarone breathed in a decanter, and the candlelight danced in the deep red liquid. "You look like you've been doing this your whole life," Jalita said, pouring 2 glasses. She leaned forward, the amber light catching the sharp marble of her jaw. "The queen of the hospital, now the queen of the city. Tell me, Elena, does it feel different? Being the one cared for instead of the one doing the caring." Elena took a sip of the wine, the velvet heat of the alcohol matching the tension in the room. "It feels dangerous," she admitted, her voice dropping. "I'm used to being the person with the plan. With you, I feel like the plan is constantly changing." Jalita reached across the table, her fingers finally interlacing with Elena's. She didn't just touch her hand, she traced the pulse point on Elena's wrist with her thumb. "The plan hasn't changed, Elena," Jalita murmured, her gaze dropping to Elena's lips and staying there. "The destination was always right here. I just wanted to see if you were brave enough to arrive." Jalita leaned closer, her voice a low, sultry vibrato that cut through the jazz. "Now that you're here, what are you going to do with me?" The air in the booth felt like it had been stripped of oxygen, leaving only the scent of dark wine and Jalita's perfume. Elena felt the phantom weight of the stethoscope she usually wore, but here, in the silk and the amber light, she realized she didn't need a medical instrument to hear the heart thumping in the room. Elena didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she leaned in, her bare back arching slightly as she matched Jalita's proximity. The surgeon was gone, replaced by a woman who spent her life making split-second, life-altering decisions. "You think you're the only one who knows how to read a room, Jalita?" Elena whispered, her voice gaining a smoky, confident edge. "I spend my days navigating the most complex systems in the world. I know exactly when a pulse quickens." She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers firmly with Jalita's, her thumb pressing back against her skin. "What am I going to do?" Elena repeated, her gaze dropping to Jalita's mouth and staying there with clinical intensity before snapping back to those storm gray eyes. "I think I'm going to stop letting you lead the dance. You've spent weeks orchestrating a siege. You've sent the gifts, you've made the moves, you've bought the wine." Elena reached out with her free hand, her fingers trailing slowly up Jalita's silk-clad arm, stopping just at the sensitive skin of her neck. She felt the slight shudder that went through the Iron Woman, a tiny crack in the corporate armor that felt like a massive victory. But in my theater, Elena murmured, her lips now inches from Jelida's, I'm the one who decides when the magic starts. And right now, I'm deciding that the long game is over. Jelida's breath hitched. The predatory smirk was completely gone, replaced by a look of genuine, electrified surprise. She looked like a woman who had finally met her match, and she was loving every second of the defeat. Is that a command, Daughteressa? Jelida rasped, her hand tightening on Elena's. It's a diagnosis, Elena countered. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the silk curtain of their booth flickered. A man in a sharp, silver suit, one of the board members from the soft meeting earlier, stuck his head in, a fake, oily smile plastered on his face. Jelida, I thought that was you. I didn't think you'd be out celebrating the Sterling merger so soon. He stopped dead. His eyes started from Jelida's fierce, protective stance to Elena, who looked like a dark-haired goddess carved from obsidian and silk. Jelida didn't even turn her head. She kept her eyes locked on Elena, but her voice went ice-cold, the CEO returning in a heartbeat. Get out, Marcus. If you breathe a word of this or interrupt us again, I'll make sure your seat on the board is replaced by a coat rack by Monday morning. The man went pale, muttered a frantic apology, and vanished. Jelida didn't miss a beat. She turned back to Elena, the ice melting back into a sultry, molten heat. As I was saying, you were giving me a diagnosis? Chapter 13. The Diagnosis. The tension in the booth didn't just break, it reconstituted into something far more pressurized. Elena didn't pull her hand back after Marcus's interruption. Instead, she leaned in further, the gold chains on her dress clinking softly against the mahogany table. A diagnosis, Elena murmured, her voice a low, clinical hum that vibrated against Jelida's senses. You've spent so much time being the Iron CEO, building walls and controlling the narrative, that you've forgotten what it feels like to lose a little control. Your heart rate is up, your pupils are dilated, and your iron is starting to melt. Elena's fingers moved from Jelida's neck to her jaw, her touch firm, mirroring the way she might hold a patient's head before summoning the magic. But there was nothing professional about this. You wanted to see if I was brave enough to arrive, Jelida? I'm here. But I don't follow anyone's lead once I'm in the room. Jelida's breath caught. She was a woman who dictated terms to prime ministers and boardrooms, but under Elena's steady, blue fire gaze, she felt a delicious, terrifying surge of vulnerability. She wasn't used to being handled, especially not with this kind of quiet, surgical authority. You're pushing your luck, Daughteressa, Jelida rasped, though she leaned into the touch, her eyes hooded and dark. I'm not one of your residents. I don't take orders well. I'm not giving orders, Elena countered, her thumb tracing the lower curve of Jelida's lip. I'm making a projection. And my projection says that you're going to pay the check, walk me to that Ferrari, and take me somewhere where there aren't any board members or silver-suited vultures to interrupt us. Elena paused, her gaze dropping to the pulse point in Jelida's neck, which was visibly thrumming. Unless, of course, the Iron Woman is actually afraid of what happens when the long game finally ends. Jelida's reaction was instantaneous. She didn't say a word. She signaled the waiter with a sharp flick of her hand, tossed a black titanium card onto the leather folder without even looking at the total, and stood up. She reached down, grabbing Elena's hand and pulling her up with a strength that was pure, unfiltered intent. She led Elena out of L'Eclisse, her stride so commanding that the crowd parted like the Red Sea. She didn't care about the stares anymore. She didn't care about the whispers. As they reached the Ferrari, Jelida pinned Elena against the matte black door, her hands framing Elena's face. The cool night air of Milan hit them, but the heat between them was blistering. You want to see how far you can push me, Elena? Jelida whispered, her forehead resting against Elena's. Careful. I might just push back. She opened the door, Her eyes locked on Elena's with a challenge that was part promise, part threat. Get in. We're going to my penthouse. And I suggest you buckle up, I'm done being subtle. Chapter 14, Top of the World. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, a sprawling expanse of polished concrete, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass that made the Milan skyline look like a glittering carpet laid out for Jalida's feet. The air was cooler here, smelling of expensive rain and the distant hum of the city. Jalida didn't turn on the lights. The ambient glow from the Duomo and the surrounding skyscrapers provided a soft, amber and blue illumination that caught the sharp angles of the furniture and the gold chains on Elena's dress. Jalida tossed her keys onto a marble console and turned, her silhouette framed by the massive windows. She looked at Elena, her eyes tracking the way the surgeon moved into the space, not with the hesitation of a guest, but with the calculated grace of a woman who was already mapping the room. "Welcome to the top of the world, Elena," Jalida murmured, her voice echoing slightly. She walked to a minimalist bar and poured 2 fingers of top-shelf tequila, the amber liquid catching the light. She didn't offer a glass. She drank hers in one slow, deliberate motion, her eyes never leaving Elena's. No board members. No patients. Just the Iron Woman and the surgeon. Now, where were we? Elena didn't stay by the door. She walked toward the window, her reflection ghosting over the city lights. She stopped just inches from the glass, the height dizzying, but her voice was steady. "We were discussing control," Elena said, turning to face the room. She leaned back against the window, the cold glass a sharp contrast to the heat blooming in her chest. "You've built this fortress, Jalida. This high, lonely place where you can see everything but no one can reach you. It's impressive. But it's also a cage." Jalida stepped into the light, her expression shifting from a smirk to something more raw. She set the glass down with a sharp clack. "A cage? I built this empire. I don't get trapped, Elena. I'm the one who holds the keys. Are you?" Elena challenged, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper. She stepped away from the window, moving into Jalida's space until they were heart to heart. She reached out, her fingers tracing the gold belt at Jalida's waist. "Because from where I'm standing, the Iron CEO is terrified of what happens when she stops being the most powerful person in the room." Elena leaned in, her lips brushing against Jalida's ear, mimicking the move Jalida had made in the hospital hallway. "You've spent weeks trying to diagnose me, Jalida. But I think you're the one who needs intervention. You're so used to people bowing to your will that you don't know what to do with someone who isn't impressed by your Ferrari or your penthouse." Jalida's breath hitched, her hands coming up to grip Elena's waist, her fingers digging into the silk of the dress. The iron was visibly melting now, her composure fracturing under the weight of Elena's directness. "You think you can just walk in here and dismantle me, Elena?" Jalida rasped, her eyes dark with a mix of frustration and desire. "I don't think," Elena countered, her gaze locking onto Jalida's with surgical precision. "I know. Because I can feel your heart racing right now. And it isn't because of the tequila." Jalida didn't respond with words. She closed the distance, her mouth crashing against Elena's in a kiss that was part surrender, part reclamation. It was a collision of 2 forces that had been circling each other for weeks, the surgical precision of the doctor and the relentless intent of the CEO. Elena didn't just let it happen. She met it with a fierce, controlled passion of her own, her hands tangling in Jalida's dark hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left between the hospital and the penthouse. Chapter 15, Final Release. The penthouse was silent, save for the frantic synchronization of their breathing and the distant, muffled hum of Milan. The city lights blurred into a bouquet of gold and blue against the glass, a backdrop for a collision that had been building since a 6-year-old boy first poked a sleeping surgeon's nose. Jalida had started this as the aggressor, her hands possessive on Elena's waist, her kiss a corporate takeover. But Elena wasn't a board member to be intimidated. She was a woman who navigated the most delicate structures of the human body for a living. She knew exactly where the pressure points were. Elena broke the kiss just enough to gasp for air, her forehead resting against Jelida's. "You're rushing, CEO," Elena whispered, her voice a low, raspy command. "In surgery, haste is a liability. You have to feel the rhythm before you make the cut." Elena's hands slid down Jelida's back, her fingers tracing the line of her spine with agonizing slowness. She felt the Iron Woman shudder, a long, low vibration that started in her shoulders and ended in a soft moan. "I've spent weeks imagining this," Jelida rasped, her composure finally splintering. She moved to lift Elena, her intent clear, but Elena stepped back, just an inch. "Not yet," Elena countered. She reached for the gold belt at Jelida's waist, her movements precise and steady. She unclipped it, the heavy metal hitting the polished concrete with a sharp clack. She moved with a calm authority that turned the penthouse into her operating theater, and Jelida, the woman who commanded thousands, was suddenly, willingly, the patient. Elena pushed the silk jumpsuit off Jelida's shoulders, her gaze never wavering. She was diagnosing the desire in Jelida's eyes, watching the way the pupils dilated until the gray was almost swallowed by black. "You want to be the one in control, Jelida?" Elena murmured, her lips trailing down the column of Jelida's neck. "Then show me. Show me the woman who doesn't need the Ferrari or the boardroom. Show me what's underneath the iron." The challenge was the final spark. Jelida let out a sound that was half growl, half sob, and reclaimed the space between them. She swept Elena up, the black silk dress bunching against her thighs, and carried her to the oversized leather sofa that faced the skyline. The power shifted like a tide. Jelida was no longer performing, she was unraveling. Her touches became frantic, searching for the heat Elena had been hoarding behind her professional mask. Elena met her with an intensity that was raw and unfiltered, her legs tangling with Jelida's, her hands finding the marble-carved muscles of Jelida's back. The banter was gone. There was only the language of skin and breath. Elena felt the moment Jelida finally broke, the moment the Iron CEO completely disappeared, leaving only a woman desperate for the connection Elena offered. As they reached the precipice, Elena arched her back, her head tilting to the left in that signature move, summoning the magic one last time. But this wasn't for a patient. The climax hit them like a physical shock, a blinding white light that made the Milan skyline vanish. Elena clung to Jelida, her fingers digging into those strong shoulders, while Jelida buried her face in the crook of Elena's neck, her entire body trembling with the force of the release. The long game hadn't just ended. It had been won by both of them. The aftermath. They lay there for a long time, tangled in the discarded silk of the black dress and the remnants of Jelida's suit. The silence was different now, no longer pressurized, but heavy and warm. Jelida was the first to move, her fingers lazily tracing the suture-like gold chains of Elena's dress that lay tangled on the floor. She looked at Elena, her gray eyes soft and clear for the first time since they'd met. "I think," Jelida whispered, her voice a beautiful, wrecked hum, "that my diagnosis was correct. You are a very dangerous woman, Dr. Montgomery." Elena smiled, leaning her head against Jelida's chest, listening to the steady, slowing thrum of her heart. "And I think you're a terrible patient, CEO. You don't follow instructions at all." Jelida laughed, a genuine, throat-deep sound that made Elena's heart skip. She kissed the top of Elena's head. "I suppose we'll just have to keep practicing until I get it right." Chapter 16. Truths Laid Bare. The dawn over Milan was a bruised purple, slowly bleeding into gold behind the spires of the Duomo. The city was waking up, the distant hum of trams and the first few cars on the ring road, but up here, 40 stories above the cobblestones, the world was silent. Jelida stood by the railing, draped in a heavy silk robe the color of charcoal. She handed Elena a small, white porcelain cup. The espresso was dark, thick, and topped with a perfect crema. To the survivors, Jalida murmured, her voice still rough from the night. Elena leaned against the glass, the cool morning air raising goosebumps on her bare arms. She was wrapped in one of Jalida's oversized cashmere sweaters, the scent of sandalwood still clinging to the wool. She took a sip of the coffee, the bitter heat grounding her. "I've spent 10 years trying to find this," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Not the penthouse or the espresso. The stillness. My friends used to set me up on these clinical blind dates. I'd show up in my scrubs, smelling like antiseptic, and they'd look at me like I was a puzzle they didn't want to solve. The moment my beeper went off, they were gone. I started to think I was just a ghost in my own life. Elena looked at Jalida, her blue eyes clear in the morning light. I stopped looking for a connection because I didn't think I had the magic for it outside of the OR. I thought I was only useful when I was holding a scalpel. Jalida turned, her gray eyes reflecting the rising sun. She reached out, her fingers catching a stray lock of Elena's hair. "And I," Jalida said, her voice dropping, "have spent 10 years surrounded by people who claim to connect with me. But they aren't looking at me, Elena. They are looking at the Carducci name. They are looking at the stock price. They want to be seen with the Iron CEO so they can feel some of that reflected heat." She looked out at the city she helped build, her expression weary. It's a different kind of ghost. Being surrounded by people and yet being completely invisible. They want the power, the Ferrari, the influence. But they never wanted the woman who stays up at night worrying if she's actually built anything that matters. Jalida stepped closer, her hand sliding into the oversized sleeve of the sweater to find Elena's hand. "When you looked at me in that hallway," Jalida whispered, "you weren't looking at a CEO. You were looking at a woman who is terrified for her nephew. You saw the Zia before you saw the iron. And last night, when you pushed back, you weren't looking for power. You were looking for me." Elena squeezed her hand, the connection feeling more solid than any surgical knot she'd ever tied. "I found you, Jalida. I'm not letting go just because the sun came up." Jalida smiled, a soft, private thing that the board members of Carducci Tech would never recognize. "Good. Because I have a feeling the outside world is going to be very annoyed that we're ignoring it today." Chapter 17. Invasion by Piero. The intimate quiet of the dawn was shattered not by a phone call or a board member, but by the frantic, rhythmic thumping of small sneakers against the hallway carpet. The penthouse door didn't just open, it burst inward. Piero, his dark curls a chaotic mess and his energy clearly fully restored, charged into the living room like a guided missile. "Zia. Elena," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high concrete ceilings. He didn't hesitate, scrambling onto the oversized sofa and wedging himself right between the CEO and the surgeon. Elena instinctively reached out to check his balance, her doctor's eyes immediately scanning his pupils and the way he moved. He looked perfect. Liliana walked in behind him, carrying a bag of fresh pastries that smelled of almond and sugar. She stopped dead when she saw them, Jalida in her charcoal robe and Elena wrapped in the massive, expensive cashmere sweater, their hair a matching mess of sleep and shared secrets. Liliana didn't say a word at first. She just slowly lowered her sunglasses, her gaze moving from her sister's unusually softened expression to the way Elena's hand was resting comfortably on Jalida's knee. A slow, knowing smirk spread across her face. "So," Liliana said, her Italian accent dry and sharp, "I see the long game reached its conclusion. I hope the surgeon didn't find too much rust on the Iron Woman's heart." Jalida cleared her throat, trying to summon her boardroom dignity while a 6-year-old was currently using her arm as a pillow. "We were just discussing the follow-up care, Liliana." "Of course," Liliana countered, stepping closer. She leaned down as she passed Jalida, whispering in a voice low enough that only her sister could hear, but fierce enough to carry the weight of a lifetime. "Non rovinarlo, Jalida. Don't fuck it up. She is the best thing that has ever walked into this family. If you break her, I will break you." Jalida's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She just looked at Elena, who was currently laughing as Piero tried to explain a dream he had about a giant gelato. The call of duty. The domestic bliss lasted exactly until 9 a.m. First, it was Giulitta's phone. It vibrated against the marble table with the persistence of a hornet. She stepped into the kitchen to take it, her voice dropping back into that cold, lethal, iron CEO tone. "I don't care what the Sterling lawyers said, Alberto. If they want the patents, they pay the premium. Tell them the price just went up 10% for wasting my morning. I'll be in the office by noon." A moment later, Elena's beeper, the one she had hidden under a silk pillow, began its rhythmic, demanding chirp. She pulled it out, her face instantly shifting into head of thoracic mode. "It's the hospital," Elena said, her voice regretful but certain. "3 new consultations, and one of my post-ops is running a fever. I have to go." They stood in the center of the penthouse, the outside world finally pulling at the threads of their private sanctuary. Giulitta walked over, ignoring the buzzing phone in her hand, and pulled Elena into a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of espresso and promises. "The board wants my head on a platter, and the hospital wants your hands on a scalpel," Giulitta whispered against her lips. "Business as usual?" Elena teased. "Hardly," Giulitta countered, her gray eyes fierce. "Tonight. My car. Your apartment. No dresses, no fancy restaurants. Just us." Elena smiled, the magic feeling more real than it ever had in the OR. "It's a date, CEO." As they headed for the elevator, Elena in her scrubs and Giulitta in a power suit, Piero waved from the balcony. The world was waiting, but for the first time, neither of them felt like they were facing it alone. Chapter 18. The Uniform of Belonging. The elevator doors slid open in the hospital's executive parking garage, and Elena stepped out, looking significantly less like the head of thoracic surgery and significantly more like someone who had been thoroughly distracted. The charcoal cashmere sweater hung halfway down her thighs, the sleeves rolled up in thick, soft cuffs to free her hands. But it was the slacks that were the real giveaway, tailored for Giulitta's long, model-esque legs. They pulled around Elena's ankles, forcing her to walk with a slight, careful lift of her heels. She looked soft, rumpled, and undeniably claimed. Giulitta walked beside her, her own power suit back on, her Iron CEO mask firmly in place for the benefit of the security cameras. But as they reached the entrance to the surgical wing, Giulitta stopped. She reached out, tucked a stray auburn lock behind Elena's ear, and then lingered, her hand resting on the back of Elena's neck. "You look ridiculous in those pants," Giulitta whispered, a playful spark returning to her gray eyes. "But I've never wanted to cancel a board meeting more in my life." "I have a pair of emergency scrubs in my locker," Elena said, her face heating up as she noticed a group of residents staring from the far end of the hall. "I'll be back in uniform in 10 minutes. "The scrubs are for the hospital, Elena," Giulitta countered, leaning in to steal one last, brief kiss that silenced the whispering residents. "But that sweater? That belongs to you now. Consider it a down payment on tonight." The collision of worlds. By 11 a.m., the separate pressures of their lives reached a boiling point. In the boardroom, Giulitta was facing a firing squad. Marcus, still smarting from being kicked out of the restaurant, had indeed leaked a tip about Giulitta's lack of focus. "The Sterling merger is stalling because you're playing house with a doctor," Giulitta, Alberto spat, slamming a folder onto the table. "We need a leader, not a romantic." Giulitta didn't even blink. She sat back, her fingers steepled. "The Sterling merger isn't stalling because of my personal life, Alberto. It's stalling because I'm currently investigating your nephew for the leak that happened last night. If I find his IP address tied to that tabloid story, the only merger you'll be worried about is your assets merging with a legal defense fund." The room went cold. The iron was back, sharper and more dangerous than before. Meanwhile, in consultation room 3, Elena was facing her own crisis. A high-profile case had been flown in, a complicated cardiac tumor that 3 other surgeons had turned down. Elena looked at the scans, the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders. Usually, she would feel the isolation of this moment, the heavy burden of being the final word. But as she leaned back, she felt the soft itch of the cashmere sweater against her skin. She wasn't alone. She picked up her phone and sent a single text, "Complicated case. I'm going to need to summon some serious magic today." 2 seconds later, her phone buzzed. The CEO of Carducci Tech has officially authorized an unlimited supply of magic. Also, keep the sweater on during the consult. It's lucky. Gee. Elena smiled, tucked the phone away, and looked at the patient's family. "I've reviewed the scans," she said, her voice ringing with a new kind of confidence. "It's a difficult operation, but we're going to get him through it." Chapter 19. The Eye of the Storm. The stakes are shifting. For Elena, this isn't just a surgery, it's a high-stakes performance that will be etched into the medical record forever. The weight of those cameras, combined with the unoperable status of the case, would break a lesser surgeon. But Elena Montgomery isn't a lesser surgeon. She's the woman who summoned the magic for Piero, and now she has the Iron CEO in her corner. The consultation room was thick with a different kind of silence, the silence of desperate hope. The patient's family sat across from Elena, their eyes searching hers for the lie that the other 3 surgeons had told them. "I won't lie to you," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady rhythm that instantly lowered the temperature in the room. "The tumor is entwined with the pulmonary artery. It's a maze. But I've spent my life studying mazes." When the father mentioned the filming for their foundation, the residents behind Elena shifted uncomfortably. A camera meant every slip, every hesitation, and every drop of blood would be immortalized. It was a career ender if things went south. Elena didn't hesitate. She adjusted the cuff of Jelida's oversized sweater, feeling the soft cashmere against her skin like a secret armor. "You can film. If it helps others understand the procedure, then it's worth the pressure. We schedule for 48 hours from now. I want my team rested, and I want my focus absolute." The intentional evening. That night, when the matte black Ferrari pulled up to Elena's minimalist apartment, the dynamic had shifted again. The long game was over, replaced by something deeper, a mutual recognition of the storms they both had to weather. Elena opened the door before Jelida could even knock. She wasn't wearing the black dress or the hospital scrubs. She was in a simple silk camisole and leggings, her hair pushed back, looking vulnerable but entirely present. Jelida stepped inside, carrying a single bag from a quiet deli, no 5-star chefs tonight. She took one look at Elena's face and saw the surgical ghost starting to creep back in, that distant look of a woman already mentally rehearsing a million different incisions. "You're already in the OR, aren't you?" Jelida asked softly, setting the food on the counter. Elena started to offer a professional deflection, but she stopped. She walked over to Jelida and wrapped her arms around the CEO's waist, burying her face in the crook of her neck. "It's a 4-doctor refusal case, Jelida. And they're filming. If I miss by a millimeter, the whole world sees it." Jelida's hands came up to frame Elena's face, her thumbs smoothing the tension out of Elena's brow. The Iron Woman was gone, replaced by the only person in the world who understood what it was like to have 1,000 lives resting on your decisions. "Then tonight, you don't have to be the best thoracic surgeon in the country," Jelida whispered, her gaze intense and grounding. "Tonight, you just have to be Elena. Let me be the one who carries the weight for a few hours." Elena leaned into the touch, her attention becoming sharp and intentional. She didn't want to talk about the pulmonary artery. She wanted the sandalwood scent of Jelida's skin. She wanted the heat of the woman who had fought a boardroom for her. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of Jelida's jaw before pulling her down into a kiss that wasn't about power or games. It was an anchor. "Stay," Elena murmured against her lips. "I don't want the penthouse or the city tonight. I just want the stillness." Jelida didn't need to be told twice. She led Elena toward the sofa, the city lights of Elena's quieter neighborhood twinkling outside. For the next 48 hours, the world would demand everything from them. The board would scream for Jolita's focus, and the cameras would wait for Elena's hands to tremble. But tonight, the magic was private. Chapter 20. The Language of Steel and Spirit. The 48-hour countdown was a blur of high-protein meals, surgical rehearsals with 3D printed models, and the quiet, grounding presence of Jolita. While Jolita crushed a hostile board motion in the mornings, she spent the evenings at Elena's apartment, ensuring the surgeon slept, ate, and stayed out of her own head. Now, the silence of the OR was different. It was heavy with the presence of 3 high-definition cameras mounted on the booms, streaming the procedure to a global surgical conference and the family's foundation. The observation gallery was packed. In the front row, Jolita sat with her arms crossed, her face a mask of stone. Beside her, Liliana gripped her hand so tight her knuckles were white. Scattered behind them were medical students, rivals, and even a few of the board members who had called Jolita soft. They had come to see if the Iron CEO's distraction would cost a life. Below, in the pit of the theater, Elena was a statue. Vivaldi. Winter, Elena commanded. The frantic, icy violins began to soar. Elena stood over the patient, her eyes closed. She performed her signature move, the sharp tilt of her head to the left, the audible click of her neck, and the magic descended. She wasn't a woman in love. She was a biological engineer at the height of her powers. Scalpel, she said. The first incision was a masterpiece of efficiency. Elena worked through the chest wall with a speed that made the observing residents gasp. But then, she reached the heart. There it is, Elena whispered. The tumor was a jagged, ugly thing, fused to the wall of the pulmonary artery like burnt sugar on a glass plate. The cameras are zoomed in, Dr. Montgomery, the tech whispered. I don't care about the cameras, Elena snapped, her focus narrowing until the entire world was only 10 centimeters wide. I need the bipolar cautery and the microdissector. Now. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in tension. Elena had to peel the tumor away from the artery wall, a structure only millimeters thick. If she went too deep, the artery would burst and the patient would bleed out on camera in seconds. If she didn't go deep enough, the tumor would regrow. The Vivaldi reached a crescendo of frantic strings. Elena's hands were perfectly still, supernaturally still. Under the high magnification scope, her tools moved like the legs of a spider, teasing, lifting, and snaring the invading tissue. She's too close to the valve, a rival surgeon whispered in the gallery. Jolita didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on Elena's hands. She recognized that stillness. It was the same stillness Elena had used to dismantle her defenses in the penthouse. Almost there, Elena breathed. With a final, microscopic flick of her wrist, the last of the mass came free. She lifted it out of the chest cavity, the dark, necrotic tissue looking small and insignificant in the sterile light. Tumor out, Elena announced. Margins look clean. Start the reconstruction. The room didn't erupt in cheers, not yet. The reconstruction of the artery was just as delicate. But the impossible part was over. Elena's hands moved with a rhythmic, lyrical grace, suturing the vessel with threads thinner than a human hair. When the final stitch was placed and the heart began to beat on its own, strong, steady, and free of the mass, Elena finally stepped back. She looked up at the observation gallery. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the board members. She looked directly at Jolita. Elena raised a gloved hand, a small, weary salute. The Iron CEO stood up, a slow, triumphant smile breaking across her face. The vultures in the gallery were silent. There was no more talk of distraction. There was only the undeniable brilliance of the woman who had just performed a miracle on worldwide television. The exit. Elena walked out of the scrub room, her back aching and her eyes burning, but her heart was light. She found Jolita waiting in the hallway, far away from the cameras and the press. Jalita didn't say anything. She simply walked up and wrapped Elena in a hug that was fierce and protective. "You did it," Jalita whispered into her hair. "The whole world was watching and you were perfect." "I told you," Elena rasped, leaning her weight into the woman who had become her sanctuary. "I had a very high-quality down payment on my focus." Jalita laughed, pulling back to look at her. "The board is terrified of you now, Elena. They realize that if I'm distracted by a woman who can do that, then I'm more dangerous than ever." Chapter 21. Montgomery Miracle. The medical world exploded. By the time Elena finished her post-op notes, the footage of the Montgomery Miracle had been shared across every major surgical forum on the planet. The hashtag summoning the magic was trending, and for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't just a respected surgeon, she was a phenomenon. But while the world was shouting her name, Elena was in the quiet of her office, her feet up on the desk, staring at that original business card she had finally moved from the drawer to a frame on her shelf. The door opened, and the Iron CEO walked in. Jalita looked at the framed card and smirked. "I see you've decided to treat that like a relic," Jalita teased, though her eyes were soft. She leaned over the desk, dropping 2 first-class tickets to Florence. "The world won't stop screaming for you, Elena. Every medical school from Harvard to Tokyo wants a piece of your time. Which is why we are leaving. Tonight." "Tonight?" Elena gasped. "Jalita, the gala is in 3 days." "Exactly," Jalita interrupted, catching Elena's hand and pulling her up. 3 days is plenty of time for a private villa, a bottle of wine older than both of us, and absolutely 0 cameras. We fly back for the gala, but until then, the Montgomery Carducci Alliance is going off the grid. The weekend, the sanctuary. The villa was tucked into the rolling hills of Tuscany, surrounded by olive groves and a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. There were no pagers here. No board members. No scrub tech waiting for an instruction. For 48 hours, they existed in a world made of sunlight and silk. Jalita, the woman who ruled a tech empire, spent the afternoon teaching Elena how to pick the perfect truffle, her iron persona completely dissolved into the warmth of the Italian sun. Elena, the woman who navigated the human heart, finally let her own beat without the pressure of a ticking clock. They spent their nights on a terrace overlooking the valley. The only magic being summoned was the kind that happened in the quiet moments between them. "I don't think I can go back to the ghost life," Elena murmured one evening, leaning her head on Jalita's shoulder as they watched the fireflies dance in the groves. "You won't have to," Jalita promised, her arm tightening around her. "The ghost is dead, Elena. You're the queen now. And a queen needs her consort." The return. The annual hospital gala. When they returned to Milan for the gala, the atmosphere was electric. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a sea of black ties and evening gowns, but the moment the doors opened for the guests of honor, the room went silent. Elena stepped in, wearing a dress that Jalita had commissioned from a top Italian designer. It was a deep, shimmering emerald green, the color of life, with a high slit and a neckline that was both elegant and daring. On her arm, Jalita wore a tuxedo that was so sharply tailored it looked like a weapon. They didn't walk in as a doctor and her benefactor. They walked in as a power couple that had successfully merged the worlds of science and commerce. As they moved through the room, the same doctors who had once looked at Elena with clinical detachment now watched her with awe. The board members who had doubted Jalita now scrambled to stay in her good graces. Liliana was there, looking radiant, holding Piero's hand. The little boy was in a tiny tuxedo, looking every bit the Carducci heir. When he saw Elena, he didn't care about the formality. He broke away from his mother and ran to her. "Dottoressa, you look like a princess," he cheered, hugging her knees. Elena picked him up, laughing, the emerald silk of her dress swirling around her. She looked at Jalita, who was watching them with a look of such pure, unadulterated pride that it finally silenced any lingering doubts. Speech! Speech! The crowd began to chant. Elena walked to the podium, Piero still on her hip. She looked out at the faces of her colleagues, the families she had helped, and the woman who had changed everything. They say that surgery is the art of the possible, Elena began, her voice clear and resonant. But I've learned recently that the most important operations don't happen in a theater. They happen when we're brave enough to let someone else see what's inside us. To summon the magic, you first have to be willing to believe in it. She looked directly at Jalita. I'd like to thank my chief of motivation for reminding me that even a surgeon needs a heart of her own. The room erupted. In the back, Marcus and Alberto looked at their shoes, realizing that the Iron CEO hadn't gone soft. She had just found the one thing more powerful than her empire. As the music started, Jalita walked onto the floor, holding out her hand to Elena. I believe I was promised a dance, Daughteressa, Jalita whispered. The ball is in your court, CEO, Elena replied, stepping into her arms. And as the violins of a modern Vivaldi arrangement began to play, they danced, two titans who had finally found their center in each other. Epilogue: The Architecture of Us. A year had passed since the Montgomery miracle, and the city of Milan had grown accustomed to the sight of the matte black Ferrari and the sensible sedan parked side by side in the driveway of a newly restored villa on the outskirts of the city. The wedding had been the event of the decade, though the press was kept miles away by a security detail that only a tech mogul could coordinate. They had exchanged vows in the Tuscan olive grove where they had first truly found each other. Elena had worn a gown of ivory silk that mimicked the fluid grace of her surgical hands, and Jalita had stood at the altar in a white tuxedo, her iron mask completely shattered as she watched Elena walk toward her. Liliana had been the maid of honor, and Piero, standing tall and healthy, had carried the rings with a seriousness that suggested he was already practicing for his future as a Carducci leader. The balance of power. Now, 12 months later, the rhythm of their lives was a symphony of high-stakes tension and domestic softness. In the mornings, the villa was a whirlwind of power. Jalita would be on a secure line with Tokyo, her voice cutting through corporate red tape with the same lethal precision as always. Elena would be reviewing scans for a 6 a.m. bypass, her brow furrowed in concentration. They were still the titans, the Iron CEO and the surgeon, and the world still trembled and marveled at their respective wakes. But the ghost life was a distant memory. Now, when Elena's beeper went off at 3 a.m., she didn't wake up to a cold room and a silent apartment. She woke up to the warmth of Jalita's arm draped over her waist and a sleepy, "Go save them, amore. I'll have the espresso waiting when you get back." And when Jalita returned home from a brutal board meeting, she didn't retreat into a glass cage of isolation. She walked through the door to find Elena, often still in her scrubs, but with the sleeves rolled up, waiting with a glass of top-shelf tequila and a look that said, "The CEO is closed for the night. I just want my wife." The private magic. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the villa was filled with the scent of rosemary and the sound of Piero's laughter. He was out in the garden, showing his Auntie Elena how he could now run full sprints without losing his breath. Jalita stood on the terrace, watching them. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Elena, looking relaxed in a pair of soft linen trousers and a thin silk camisole. "He looks good, doesn't he?" Elena whispered, leaning her head on Jalita's shoulder. "He looks alive," Jalita corrected, her voice thick with an emotion she never showed the board. She turned to Elena, her gray eyes reflecting the soft Italian sun. "We both do." Jalita reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object. It was a fountain pen, the same dark Italian resin one she had gifted Elena a year ago. She tucked it into the pocket of Elena's cardigan. "I noticed this one was running low on ink," Jalita teased, her smirk returning. "And since you're the woman who writes the magic, I can't have you losing your edge." Elena laughed, pulling Gelida into a kiss that tasted of home and 1,000 shared victories. The world still wanted their time, their talent, and their steel. The cameras still waited for a slip, and the vultures still circled the empire. But as they stood together, overlooking the life they had built from a chance encounter and a long game, they knew the truth. The most powerful thing they had ever built wasn't a company or a surgical reputation. It was the stillness they found in each other's arms. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and like this video and follow me for more stories. You are always welcome here, and leave me a comment or a thumbs up, just letting me know if you like the story and would like more, or is there perhaps an idea that you would like to share or let me write for you.